When the notorious Blood Spurs gang rode into Millbrook and decided to mock the silent bartender at the Last Stand Saloon, they thought they were teaching a lesson to a coward who hid behind his bar. They couldn't have been more wrong. Behind Lucas Kane's quiet demeanor and methodical glass polishing lay the deadly precision of the legendary Phantom Draw, a former marshal whose lightning-fast guns had once written justice across the Texas territory before grief and guilt drove him to trade his badge for a bartender's apron, seeking solace in silence. What began as simple mockery erupted into an explosive confrontation that would unearth a devastating betrayal, reignite a vendetta 8 years in the making, and prove that the most dangerous force isn't the one that comes thundering down the street with guns blazing, but the quiet man who's learned to live without violence, until violence becomes necessary. This is the story of how a silent bartender and his newfound family reminded a ruthless gang that true strength lies not in the speed of the draw, but in knowing when to holster your gun and when to stand your ground. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The setting sun cast long shadows through the swinging doors of the Last Stand Saloon, painting streaks of amber across its weathered wooden floor. Dust motes danced in the dying light, swirling through the warm air like tiny performers in nature's ballet. The familiar chorus of the evening was building, the clink of glasses, the scrape of boots on rough boards, and the low rumble of conversation that filled every corner of the establishment. Behind the bar stood Lucas Kane, his tall frame casting its own shadow as he methodically polished a glass with a worn rag. His movements were deliberate, almost hypnotic, as his dark eyes scanned the room without seeming to move at all. The sleeves of his white shirt were rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with lean muscle. A simple black vest hugged his broad shoulders, and a neat string tie completed his understated appearance. "Another round, Mr. Kane," called out Tom Wilson, a local rancher whose cheeks were already flushed from his previous drinks. Lucas nodded once, setting down the glass and reaching for a bottle of whiskey. He moved with the fluid grace of a mountain cat, each gesture precise and economical. The saloon itself was a testament to frontier life, a large, open room dominated by scattered tables where cowboys, miners, and townspeople gathered to forget their daily troubles. Oil lamps flickered in wall sconces, their glass chimneys smoky from constant use. A massive mirror hung behind the bar, its surface slightly warped, reflecting the scene like a window into a slightly distorted world. The wooden bar itself was polished to a soft sheen from years of elbows and spilled drinks, its surface telling silent stories of countless conversations. In one corner, a battered piano waited patiently for the evening's entertainment to begin. Above it, mounted on the wall, the stuffed head of a 12-point buck watched over the proceedings with glass eyes that caught the lamplight. The air was thick with the smell of tobacco, leather, and whiskey, the perfume of the American West. As the evening progressed, Lucas moved through his familiar routine with practiced ease. When Big Jim and Mexican Pete began arguing over a card game, Lucas simply appeared between them, setting down fresh drinks with a look that somehow managed to convey both understanding and warning. The men subsided, their dispute forgotten in the face of his quiet authority. "Dunno how you do it, Kane," muttered Sheriff Thomas Carver, nursing a coffee at the end of the bar. "Never seen a man say so much without opening his mouth." The sheriff was a weather-beaten man in his 50s, his badge pinned to a vest that had seen better days. His right hand, permanently crooked from an old injury, rested near his gun belt out of habit rather than necessity. Lucas's response was a slight tilt of his head as he wiped down the bar's surface. The sheriff wasn't wrong. Lucas had developed his own silent language over the years. A raised eyebrow could stop a fight before it began. A slight shake of his head could warn an overeager cowboy away from a card-sharp's table. His silence wasn't weakness. It was control. When the dinner rush slowed, Lucas retreated briefly to his modest room above the saloon. The space was small but meticulously neat, a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a cracked mirror, and a simple wooden chair by the window. He paused there, looking out over the town's main street as the last light faded from the sky. Millbrook was a town caught between progress and wilderness. The newly built railroad station stood proud at one end of the street, its fresh paint a stark contrast to the weather-beaten buildings around it. Settlers arrived almost daily, drawn by promises of cheap land and new opportunities. The general store, run by old Mr. Peterson, had recently added a selection of fancy Eastern goods to its shelves. Even the church had a new coat of whitewash, its spire reaching hopefully toward the heavens. But danger lurked at the edges of this progress. Reports of cattle rustling had increased in recent months. The stagecoach had been robbed twice in the past year. Sheriff Carver did his best, but his crooked hand and advancing age made him more symbol than substance. The town council talked about hiring deputies, but good men were hard to find and harder to keep. Lucas's contemplation was interrupted by a sound that sent a chill through the warm evening air. The thunder of approaching hooves. Many hooves. He watched as a group of riders appeared at the end of the street, their horses kicking up clouds of dust in the fading light. Even at a distance, their reputation preceded them like a dark cloud. The Blood Spurs gang. Townsfolk scattered as the riders approached, mothers hurrying children indoors, shopkeepers hastily locking up. The gang's leader, Dax Rowe, sat his horse like a king on a throne, his black duster catching the last rays of sunlight. His men spread out behind him, 8 hard cases with harder eyes, their spurs decorated with dried droplets of red paint that gave the gang its name. Lucas returned to the bar, his movements unhurried. He could hear the gang's boots on the boardwalk outside, their spurs jingling a deadly melody. The saloon's regular patrons tensed, some sliding away from the bar, others hunching over their drinks as if trying to become invisible. The swinging doors burst open with unnecessary force as Dax Rowe made his entrance. He was a tall man with cruel good looks, his black hair slicked back beneath a wide-brimmed hat. A silver concho tie gleamed at his throat, and his gun belt was tooled with elaborate designs. Behind him came his men, spreading out through the saloon like oil on water. Well, Dax drawled, stopping at the bar. Ain't this a nice little establishment? His eyes fixed on Lucas with predatory interest. I hear you're the man to see about a drink in this town. Lucas met his gaze steadily, waiting. What's wrong, friend? Dax's smile didn't reach his eyes. Keck out your tongue. One of his men, a weaselly fellow with a patchy beard, laughed too loudly. Maybe he's simple, boss. You know, touched in the head. Now, Clem, Dax said, not taking his eyes off Lucas. That ain't no way to talk about our new friend. I'm sure he's just shy. He leaned forward, placing both hands on the bar. How about some whiskey for me and my boys? Your best stuff. On the house, of course. Lucas turned without a word, selecting a bottle of good Kentucky bourbon. He set out glasses with mechanical precision, filling each one with 2 fingers of amber liquid. He really don't talk. Clem cackled. Hey boys, we found ourselves a genuine mute barkeep. The gang members spread around the room joined in the laughter, their voices harsh in the tense atmosphere. What's the matter, friend? Another gang member called out. Forgot how to speak English? Maybe we should teach him some sign language, boys. Lucas continued his work, seemingly oblivious to the mockery. His face remained impassive as he served the drinks, though anyone watching closely might have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes. The situation might have remained at mere mockery, if not for old Joe McCready, 3 sheets to the wind and unsteady on his feet. He stumbled back from the bar, accidentally jostling Dax's elbow and causing the outlaw to spill his drink. The change in Dax was instant. His hand dropped to his gun, the metal gleaming as it cleared the holster. Old Joe's roomy eyes widened in terror as he found himself staring down the barrel of Dax's Colt. You just cost me a drink, old man, Dax said softly, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly silent saloon. Now, how do you plan to make that right? Before Joe could stammer a response, Lucas was there, moving with that same fluid grace. He set a fresh bottle of whiskey on the bar between Dax and Joe. His eyes met Dax's, calm and unwavering. After a long moment, Dax's lip curled in a sneer, but he holstered his gun. Well, ain't you the peacemaker? Dax said, his voice dripping with contempt. He leaned in close to Lucas, close enough that the bartender could smell tobacco and leather. Let me tell you something, friend. Men like you don't last long out here. The West ain't no place for cowards who hide behind a bar. Lucas didn't flinch, didn't even blink. His stillness seemed to infuriate Dax more than any response could have. "You think your silence makes you strong?" Dax continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "It just makes you weak. A nothing. A nobody who's too scared to even speak up for himself." The gang had gathered closer, forming a loose circle around the bar. Their leader's words sparked fresh taunts and jeers. "Maybe he needs some motivation to find his voice," Clem suggested, fingering his gun belt. "Nah," Dax said, straightening up. "He ain't worth a bullet." He swept the bottle off the bar, catching it smoothly. "Thanks for the hospitality, Silent Kane. We'll be seeing you around." The gang filed out, their laughter and mockery trailing behind them like a bad smell. As they mounted up outside, Dax's voice carried clearly through the swinging doors. "Don't worry, boys. We'll teach Silent Kane some respect soon enough." The saloon remained quiet for several long moments after they'd gone, the regular patrons exchanging nervous glances. Gradually, conversation resumed, though more subdued than before. Sheriff Carver had watched the entire scene without moving, his good hand clenched around his coffee cup. Later, after the last patron had stumbled home and the lamps were turned low, Lucas moved through his closing routine. He swept the floor with steady strokes, straightened the chairs, and wiped down the bar one final time. In the dim light, his reflection in the back mirror looked older, wearier. Finally, he stood behind the bar, his hands resting lightly on its worn surface. His eyes drifted to a locked drawer beneath the cash box, a drawer that hadn't been opened in years. Inside lay something from another life, something he'd sworn never to touch again. The oil lamps flickered, making shadows dance across his face as he stood there, lost in thought. The weight of unspoken words hung in the air like smoke, and in the silence of the empty saloon, the echoes of the gang's mockery seemed to linger like ghosts of things to come. Lucas Kane turned away from the drawer, from the memories it contained, and began snuffing out the lamps one by one. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. For now, there was only the silence, the darkness, and the weight of decisions yet to be made. The setting sun cast long shadows through the swinging doors of the Last Stand Saloon, painting streaks of amber across its weathered wooden floor. Dust motes danced in the dying light, swirling through the warm air like tiny performers in nature's ballet. The familiar chorus of the evening was building. The clink of glasses, the scrape of boots on rough boards, and the low rumble of conversation that filled every corner of the establishment. Behind the bar stood Lucas Kane, his tall frame casting its own shadow as he methodically polished a glass with a worn rag. His movements were deliberate, almost hypnotic, as his dark eyes scanned the room without seeming to move at all. The sleeves of his white shirt were rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with lean muscle. A simple black vest hugged his broad shoulders, and a neat string tie completed his understated appearance. "Another round, Mr. Kane," called out Tom Wilson, a local rancher whose cheeks were already flushed from his previous drinks. Lucas nodded once, setting down the glass and reaching for a bottle of whiskey. He moved with the fluid grace of a mountain cat, each gesture precise and economical. The saloon itself was a testament to frontier life, a large, open room dominated by scattered tables where cowboys, miners, and townspeople gathered to forget their daily troubles. Oil lamps flickered in wall sconces, their glass chimneys smoky from constant use. A massive mirror hung behind the bar, its surface slightly warped, reflecting the scene like a window into a slightly distorted world. The wooden bar itself was polished to a soft sheen from years of elbows and spilled drinks, its surface telling silent stories of countless conversations. In one corner, a battered piano waited patiently for the evening's entertainment to begin. Above it, mounted on the wall, the stuffed head of a 12-point buck watched over the proceedings with glass eyes that caught the lamplight. The air was thick with the smell of tobacco, leather, and whiskey, the perfume of the American West. As the evening progressed, Lucas moved through his familiar routine with practiced ease. When Big Jim and Mexican Pete began arguing over a card game, Lucas simply appeared between them, setting down fresh drinks with a look that somehow managed to convey both understanding and warning. The men subsided, their dispute forgotten in the face of his quiet authority. "Dunno how you do it, Kane," muttered Sheriff Thomas Carver, nursing a coffee at the end of the bar. Never seen a man say so much without opening his mouth. The sheriff was a weather-beaten man in his 50s, his badge pinned to a vest that had seen better days. His right hand, permanently crooked from an old injury, rested near his gun, belt out of habit rather than necessity. Lucas's response was a slight tilt of his head as he wiped down the bar's surface. The sheriff wasn't wrong. Lucas had developed his own silent language over the years. A raised eyebrow could stop a fight before it began. A slight shake of his head could warn an overeager cowboy away from a card-sharp's table. His silence wasn't weakness, it was control. When the dinner rush slowed, Lucas retreated briefly to his modest room above the saloon. The space was small but meticulously neat. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a cracked mirror, and a simple wooden chair by the window. He paused there, looking out over the town's main street as the last light faded from the sky. Millbrook was a town caught between progress and wilderness. The newly built railroad station stood proud at one end of the street, its fresh paint a stark contrast to the weather-beaten buildings around it. Settlers arrived almost daily, drawn by promises of cheap land and new opportunities. The general store, run by old Mr. Peterson, had recently added a selection of fancy Eastern goods to its shelves. Even the church had a new coat of whitewash, its spire reaching hopefully toward the heavens. But danger lurked at the edges of this progress. Reports of cattle rustling had increased in recent months. The stagecoach had been robbed twice in the past year. Sheriff Carver did his best, but his crooked hand and advancing age made him more symbol than substance. The town council talked about hiring deputies, but good men were hard to find and harder to keep. Lucas's contemplation was interrupted by a sound that sent a chill through the warm evening air, the thunder of approaching hooves. Many hooves. He watched as a group of riders appeared at the end of the street, their horses kicking up clouds of dust in the fading light. Even at a distance, their reputation preceded them like a dark cloud, the Blood Spurs gang. Townsfolk scattered as the riders approached, mothers hurrying children indoors, shopkeepers hastily locking up. The gang's leader, Dax Rowe, sat his horse like a king on a throne, his black duster catching the last rays of sunlight. His men spread out behind him, 8 hard cases with harder eyes, their spurs decorated with dried droplets of red paint that gave the gang its name. Lucas returned to the bar, his movements unhurried. He could hear the gang's boots on the boardwalk outside, their spurs jingling a deadly melody. The saloon's regular patrons tensed, some sliding away from the bar, others hunching over their drinks as if trying to become invisible. The swinging doors burst open with unnecessary force as Dax Rowe made his entrance. He was a tall man with cruel good looks, his black hair slicked back beneath a wide-brimmed hat. A silver concho tie gleamed at his throat, and his gun belt was tooled with elaborate designs. Behind him came his men, spreading out through the saloon like oil on water. Well, Dax drawled, stopping at the bar. Ain't this a nice little establishment? His eyes fixed on Lucas with predatory interest. I hear you're the man to see about a drink in this town. Lucas met his gaze steadily, waiting. What's wrong, friend? Dax's smile didn't reach his eyes. Cat got your tongue? One of his men, a weaselly fellow with a patchy beard, laughed too loudly. Maybe he's simple, boss. You know, touched in the head. Now, Clem, Dax said, not taking his eyes off Lucas, that ain't no way to talk about our new friend. I'm sure he's just shy. He leaned forward, placing both hands on the bar. How about some whiskey for me and my boys? Your best stuff. On the house, of course. Lucas turned without a word, selecting a bottle of good Kentucky bourbon. He set out glasses with mechanical precision, filling each one with 2 fingers of amber liquid. He really don't talk. Clem cackled. Hey boys, we found ourselves a genuine mute barkeep. The gang members spread around the room joined in the laughter, their voices harsh in the tense atmosphere. What's the matter, friend? Another gang member called out. Forgot how to speak English? Maybe we should teach him some sign language, boys. Lucas continued his work, seemingly oblivious to the mockery. His face remained impassive as he served the drinks, though anyone watching closely might have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes. The situation might have remained at mere mockery, if not for old Joe McCready, 3 sheets to the wind and unsteady on his feet. He stumbled back from the bar, accidentally jostling Dax's elbow and causing the outlaw to spill his drink. The change in Dax was instant. His hand dropped to his gun, the metal gleaming as it cleared the holster. Old Joe's roomy eyes widened in terror as he found himself staring down the barrel of Dax's Colt. "You just cost me a drink, old man," Dax said softly, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly silent saloon. "Now, how do you plan to make that right?" Before Joe could stammer a response, Lucas was there, moving with that same fluid grace. He set a fresh bottle of whiskey on the bar between Dax and Joe. His eyes met Dax's, calm and unwavering. After a long moment, Dax's lip curled in a sneer, but he holstered his gun. "Well, ain't you the peacemakers?" Dax said, his voice dripping with contempt. He leaned in close to Lucas, close enough that the bartender could smell tobacco and leather. "Let me tell you something, friend. Men like you don't last long out here. The West ain't no place for cowards who hide behind a bar." Lucas didn't flinch, didn't even blink. His stillness seemed to infuriate Dax more than any response could have. "You think your silence makes you strong?" Dax continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "It just makes you weak. A nothing. A nobody who's too scared to even speak up for himself." The gang had gathered closer, forming a loose circle around the bar. Their leader's words sparked fresh taunts and jeers. "Maybe he needs some motivation to find his voice," Clem suggested, fingering his gun belt. "Nah," Dax said, straightening up. "He ain't worth a bullet." He swept the bottle off the bar, catching it smoothly. "Thanks for the hospitality, Silent Kane. We'll be seeing you around." The gang filed out, their laughter and mockery trailing behind them like a bad smell. As they mounted up outside, Dax's voice carried clearly through the swinging doors. "Don't worry, boys. We'll teach Silent Kane some respect soon enough." The saloon remained quiet for several long moments after they'd gone, the regular patrons exchanging nervous glances. Gradually, conversation resumed, though more subdued than before. Sheriff Carver had watched the entire scene without moving, his good hand clenched around his coffee cup. Later, after the last patron had stumbled home and the lamps were turned low, Lucas moved through his closing routine. He swept the floor with steady strokes, straightened the chairs, and wiped down the bar one final time. In the dim light, his reflection in the back mirror looked older, wearier. Finally, he stood behind the bar, his hands resting lightly on its worn surface. His eyes drifted to a locked drawer beneath the cash box, a drawer that hadn't been opened in years. Inside lay something from another life, something he'd sworn never to touch again. The oil lamps flickered, making shadows dance across his face as he stood there, lost in thought. The weight of unspoken words hung in the air like smoke, and in the silence of the empty saloon, the echoes of the gang's mockery seemed to linger like ghosts of things to come. Lucas Kane turned away from the drawer, from the memories it contained, and began snuffing out the lamps one by one. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. For now, there was only the silence, the darkness, and the weight of decisions yet to be made. Morning sunlight crept through Millbrook's dusty streets, bringing with it whispers that spread like wildfire. The Blood Spurs confrontation with Lucas Kane had given the townsfolk something new to talk about, and talk they did. Outside Peterson's general store, a group of women gathered, their voices hushed but animated. "Did you hear about what happened at the saloon?" Martha Peterson asked, adjusting her bonnet against the morning sun. "Those outlaws threatened our Lucas." Sarah Cooper, the blacksmith's wife, clicked her tongue. "If you ask me, he should have stood up to them right then and there. What kind of man just stands there and takes that kind of abuse?" A smart one, Benjamin Taylor, the town schoolteacher, interjected as he passed by. "Violence only begets more violence." Mr. Kane showed remarkable restraint. "Restraint," scoffed Dick Williams, leaning against a hitching post. "Sounds like cowardice to me. Town's got enough troubles without a yellow-bellied barkeep bringing more down on us." The conversation might have continued, but all talk ceased as a young woman strode purposefully down the boardwalk. Ella Montgomery's blue calico dress swished around her ankles, her honey-blonde hair neatly pinned back, but her pretty face was set in determined lines. As the saloon owner's daughter, she had more stake in this situation than most. Inside the Last Stand, Lucas was going through his morning routine, setting up for the day ahead. The scrape of the door opening made him look up, meeting Ella's fierce gaze. "We need to talk, Lucas," she declared, her hands on her hips. When he merely nodded and continued wiping down the bar, her frustration boiled over. "No, you need to actually talk. With words. I've had enough of this silent routine." Lucas set down his cleaning rag, giving her his full attention. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the hints of gray at his temples, the subtle lines around his eyes that spoke of years of worry. "The whole town's talking about what happened last night," Ella continued, her voice rising. "The Blood Spurs aren't just going to go away. They'll be back, and when they come, they'll bring trouble with them." She moved closer to the bar, her eyes pleading. "Why won't you stand up to them? You're hiding behind this silence while the town suffers, and I can't understand why." Lucas's face remained impassive, but something flickered in his dark eyes. For a moment, it seemed he would maintain his silence, but then he spoke, his voice rough from disuse. "I won't fight." The sound of his voice, so rarely heard, made Ella pause. "Why not?" "I've already lost too much." The words came out barely above a whisper, heavy with unspoken grief. "What does that mean?" Ella demanded. But Lucas had already retreated into his silence, turning away to arrange bottles on the back shelf. The saloon's door creaked open again, admitting old Jed Hawkins, already swaying slightly despite the early hour. The town drunk was a fixture at the Last Stand, tolerated because he occasionally helped with repairs and seemed to know everyone's business. Today, though, there was an unusual gleam in his bloodshot eyes. "You folks want to know about our friend Lucas here?" Jed settled onto his usual stool, his voice carrying in the empty saloon. "I heard some things, yes sir, some mighty interesting things about our quiet barkeep." Ella turned, her curiosity overcoming her frustration. "What are you talking about, Jed? Ever heard of the Phantom Draw?" Jed's roomy eyes darted between Ella and Lucas. "That's what they called him down in Texas. Fastest gun anyone had ever seen. Story goes, he once took down 3 men in a single duel. Didn't even seem to draw his gun. Just 3 shots, 3 bodies hitting the dirt." Lucas continued his work, but his movements had become more mechanical, his shoulders tense. "You're drunk, Jed," Ella scoffed, but there was uncertainty in her voice. "Drunk I may be, but I know what I know." Jed leaned forward conspiratorially. "After that shootout, he just disappeared. Some say he hung up his guns for good, haunted by the lives he'd taken. Others say he's still out there, waiting, watching." Lucas abruptly walked into the back room, leaving Ella and Jed alone. In the storage area, surrounded by barrels and crates, he allowed himself a moment of weakness. The memories came unbidden, washing over him like a flood. Sarah's laugh, bright and clear as a mountain stream, echoing through their small house. Little Tommy's drawings, stuck proudly to every available surface. Horses and cowboys, and his pa wearing a star. The smell of fresh-baked bread, and the sound of his son's excited footsteps as he ran to greet him. Then the memory shifted, darkened. Gunshots shattering the peaceful afternoon. Sarah's scream cut short. Tommy's drawings scattered across the floor, stained with something that would never wash out. The weight of his guns in his hands, the acrid smell of powder smoke, and afterward, the crushing silence that would become his constant companion. Lucas pressed his palms against his eyes, forcing the memories back into their box. When he returned to the bar, his face was composed once more, though perhaps a shade paler than before. The day passed slowly, tension building like storm clouds on the horizon. As evening approached, the saloon began to fill with its regular patrons, all of them casting nervous glances at the door. They didn't have to wait long. The Blood Spurs announced their return with the same dramatic entrance as before, boots thundering on the wooden floor, spurs jingling their deadly song. This time, they spread out through the saloon immediately, boxing in the other patrons. "Evening, friends," Dax called out, his voice carrying a sharp edge of anticipation. "Hope you got plenty of whiskey ready, Silent Kane. My boys are mighty thirsty tonight." Lucas began setting out bottles and glasses, his movements unhurried. Clem sidled up to the bar, a deck of cards appearing in his hands. "Say, barkeep," he drawled, shuffling the cards with exaggerated flair. "How about a friendly game? Unless you're scared of losing more than just your dignity. When Lucas didn't respond, Clem slapped a heavy bag of coins onto the bar. $500 says, I can read you better than you can read me. Or maybe you're too good to play with the likes of us. The challenge hung in the air. Every eye in the saloon was fixed on Lucas, waiting. Finally, he gave a single nod and pulled up a chair. The game began, other gang members gathering around to watch. Clem dealt with flourish, his confidence growing with each hand. But as the game progressed, his smile began to fade. Lucas played with the same quiet precision he brought to everything else, his face an unreadable mask. The final hand came down to just the two of them. The pot had grown enormous, and Clem's earlier bravado had been replaced by a sheen of sweat on his forehead. Lucas studied his cards, then pushed forward every chip he had. Call, Clem said, his voice cracking slightly. He laid down his cards, 3 kings, a strong hand. Lucas quietly placed his cards on the table, a pair of 2s. Clem's face split into a triumphant grin, reaching for the pot, but then he froze. Understanding dawned in his eyes as he realized what had happened. Lucas had led him into a trap, making him believe he had the stronger hand. Before Clem could react, Lucas stood and walked away from the table, leaving the money where it lay. This final insult proved too much for Clem. You think you're better than us? He snarled, his hand dropping to his gun. Enough. Dax's voice cut through the tension. He moved to the center of the room, his spurs marking each step with a silver note. I think it's time we settled this properly. He turned to face Lucas, who stood behind his bar. Tomorrow at noon, Silent Kane. You and me. Or are you too much of a coward to face me like a man? Lucas met his gaze steadily, but made no move to respond. No. Dax's smile was cold as a snake's. Well then, if you're not on that street at noon tomorrow, we'll burn this place to the ground. And maybe we won't stop with just the saloon. Maybe this whole town needs a good cleaning. He leaned forward, placing both hands on the bar. Noon tomorrow, Kane. Be there, or watch everything you care about go up in smoke. The gang filed out, leaving behind a wake of nervous whispers and fearful glances. As the last patron stumbled home that night, Lucas climbed the stairs to his room. He stood at the window for a long time, watching the moon rise over the distant mountains. Finally, he descended to the bar and approached the locked drawer. His hand hovered over it, trembling slightly. Inside lay his past, his sins, and perhaps the only hope of saving the town. But opening it would mean breaking a promise he'd made on his family's graves. The moonlight streaming through the windows cast long shadows across the floor, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out to the night. Lucas Kane stood alone in his silent saloon, facing a choice that would change everything. The morning after Dax's challenge, the Last Stand Saloon was unusually crowded for such an early hour. Most patrons nursed their coffees and whiskeys in silence, but all eyes and ears were drawn to the corner where Jed Hawkins held court, his voice carrying through the tense atmosphere. You folks think you know Lucas Kane? Jed's bloodshot eyes gleamed with the excitement of a born storyteller. Let me tell you about the time he faced down the Wilson brothers in Abilene. 3 of the meanest gunslingers you'd ever meet. We've heard this one before, Jed. Someone called out, but there was no real protest in their voice. Not like this, you haven't. Jed leaned forward, his coffee cup forgotten. It was a summer morning, hot as Satan's kitchen. The Wilson boys had been terrorizing the town for weeks. They called Lucas out, thinking he'd be easy prey. He paused for effect, looking around the room. Know what he did? Didn't say a word. Silent even then, he was. Just walked out into the street. Calm as you please. The saloon had grown quieter, everyone straining to hear. First brother Drew, fastest gun in Kansas, they said. But before his gun cleared leather, Lucas had already fired. Second brother didn't even get his hand to his holster. Third one. Jed shook his head in wonder. Third one threw down his gun and ran. They say Lucas's draw was like lightning, so fast you couldn't even see it happen. Just the flash of the guns and the thunder of the shots. In the silence that followed, Billy Preston, barely old enough to grow a proper beard, whispered, "Is that why they called him the Phantom Draw?" Partly, Jed nodded sagely. But it was more than that. He moved like a ghost, they said, silent and deadly. Some folks swore they never even saw him touch his guns. like they just appeared in his hands by magic. While Jed spun his tales, Lucas himself had slipped out of town. The morning was cool and clear, dew still clinging to the prairie grass as he made his way up the small hill where the cemetery lay. His boots left dark prints in the wet grass as he approached 3 graves beneath an old oak tree. The crosses were simple but well-maintained, the ground around them freshly weeded. Lucas knelt before them, placing a small bouquet of wildflowers he'd gathered along the way. His fingers traced the names carved into the wood, Sarah Kane on one, Thomas Kane on another. The third cross bore no name. It marked where he'd buried his guns and his old life. "I miss you," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Every day, every moment. His hand rested on Tommy's cross. He'd be 15 now, Sarah. Old enough to start courting girls, giving his old man gray hairs. A ghost of a smile crossed his face, quickly replaced by pain. His fingers dug into the earth beside the unnamed cross. "I promised I'd never pick up a gun again. Swore it right here, on your graves." But now, he fell silent, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a physical thing. Back in town, the main street had become an impromptu meeting place. The threat of the Blood Spurs had drawn people from their homes and businesses, gathering in small groups to debate their options. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to burn us out," Marcus Thompson declared, his blacksmith's apron still tied around his waist. "Someone needs to take a stand and die for their troubles." Martha Peterson shot back, clutching her shawl tight despite the warming day. "We should all leave while we can. There's nothing here worth dying for." "Nothing worth dying for?" Dick Williams stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "My father helped build this town. We've put everything we have into making a life here. I won't be run off my land by a bunch of painted-up thugs." The argument spread through the crowd like wildfire. Some voiced support for fighting back, while others began making plans to leave before the Blood Spurs returned. The town was splitting apart at the seams, fear and uncertainty driving wedges between old friends and neighbors. Ella Montgomery watched from the steps of the Last Stand, her heart heavy. When she could bear it no longer, she strode into the saloon, finding Lucas behind the bar. "They're tearing themselves apart out there," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "This town needs something to believe in, Lucas. They need someone to show them how to stand up to men like Dax Rowe." She moved closer, placing her hands on the bar. "They need a hero." Lucas met her gaze, his dark eyes filled with a pain she couldn't fully understand. "Heroes die," he said, his voice cold and flat. "So do the people around them. So we should just give up?" Ella demanded. "Let them destroy everything we've built here." Before Lucas could respond, Sheriff Carver entered the saloon. His weathered face was drawn with worry, and his crooked right hand trembled slightly as he approached the bar. "The Blood Spurs did this to me," he said quietly, holding up his mangled hand. 2 years ago, when they first came through, broke every bone, then made me watch as they burned down the Wells family farm." He paused, his good hand clenching into a fist. "I couldn't stop them then, and I can't stop them now. But maybe you can." The sound of boots on the boardwalk outside drew their attention. A tall figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the morning light. The stranger wore buckskins and moccasins, his long black hair tied back with a leather thong. A Winchester rifle was slung across his back, and a tomahawk hung at his belt. Red Hawk moved into the saloon with the fluid grace of a hunting cat, his dark eyes taking in every detail. He'd been watching the town, and Lucas, for days, biding his time. "Long time, my friend," he said, his voice deep and measured. He spoke with only the slightest accent, a reminder of his years among both whites and his own people. Though perhaps not long enough. Lucas straightened, recognition flickering across his face. "You know him?" Ella asked, looking between the two men. "We've crossed paths," Red Hawk replied when Lucas remained silent. "In darker times." He moved to the bar, his moccasins silent on the wooden floor. "We need to talk, Lucas." Alone. Once the others had left, Red Hawk leaned close, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Cole Marston is alive." Lucas went very still, his hands flat on the bar's surface. "He's been tracking you," Red Hawk continued. "These Blood Spurs, they're his dogs, sent to flush you out. Dax Rowe may wear the leader's coat, but he answers to Marston. The name triggered a flood of memories Lucas had fought so hard to suppress. He was younger then, his guns worn openly on his hips. Cole Marston had been his friend once, his deputy, when Lucas wore a marshal's star. But power corrupted Cole, turned him cruel. When Lucas tried to stop him from terrorizing innocent families, Cole had taken his revenge in blood. The shootout played out in his mind with terrible clarity. Cole and his men surrounding Lucas's home. Sarah's scream as the first shots rang out. Tommy's small body crumpled beneath his favorite drawings. Lucas's guns seemed to draw themselves, his shots finding their marks with deadly precision. But it was too late to save what mattered most. In the present, Lucas's hands clenched on the bar's surface, his knuckles white with tension. "He won't stop," Red Hawk said softly. "Not until he finishes what he started." Lucas pushed away from the bar, his decision made. He moved through the saloon with new purpose, gathering supplies from hidden corners, rope, wire, extra lanterns, tools. Red Hawk watched with understanding as Lucas began preparing the saloon not for a gunfight, but for something more calculated. Together, they worked through the day, setting up subtle defenses. A tripwire here, a reinforced door there. Lucas positioned extra oil lamps in strategic locations, arranged furniture to create choke points. He wasn't preparing for a duel. He was preparing for war. As evening approached, Red Hawk departed to scout the surrounding area, leaving Lucas alone in the saloon. The setting sun cast long shadows through the windows, painting the room in shades of gold and crimson. Lucas stood behind the bar, his eyes fixed on the locked drawer that held his past. Slowly, deliberately, he produced a key from his vest pocket. The lock turned with a soft click that seemed to echo in the empty room. Inside the drawer lay 2 revolvers, custom-made Colts with pearl grips. They gleamed in the fading light, untouched by time or dust. Lucas lifted one, feeling its familiar weight. The grip seemed to mold itself to his hand, as if the years of separation had never been. He could almost hear Sarah's voice, her last words to him. "Promise me you won't lose yourself to revenge." He set the gun back in the drawer, but didn't close it. Tomorrow would bring violence to Millbrook, one way or another. The only question was whether he would meet it with his old skills or his new wisdom. The sun sank below the horizon, leaving the saloon in deepening shadow. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, Cole Marston was waiting, using Dax Rowe and his Blood Spurs as pawns in a deadly game. Lucas Kane sat in a silent saloon, the open drawer before him like a door to his past, while the future rushed toward him like a runaway train. The morning sun had barely cleared the eastern hills when the sound of approaching horses shattered Millbrook's peace. The Blood Spurs thundered down the main street, their whoops and hollers punctuated by gunshots fired into the air. Their horses' hooves kicked up clouds of dust as they circled the town square like a pack of wolves sizing up their prey. Dax Rowe led the charge, his black duster billowing behind him as he fired his pistol skyward. "Rise and shine, good people of Millbrook," he shouted, his voice carrying over the chaos. "Time to see what kind of stuff your quiet barkeep is made of." Townsfolk scattered like leaves in a storm. Mothers grabbed their children and rushed inside. Shopkeepers hurriedly locked their doors, and windows slammed shut all along the street. Within moments, the bustling morning had transformed into a ghost town, with only the Blood Spurs' laughter echoing off the empty buildings. The gang dismounted outside the Last Stand Saloon, their spurs jingling ominously on the wooden boardwalk. Dax kicked the saloon doors open with unnecessary force, sending them crashing against the walls. Inside, Lucas Kane stood behind his bar, calmly wiping down glasses, as if it were any other morning. Well, Dax drawled, spreading his arms wide. "If it ain't the Silent Wonder himself." He strode to the bar, his boots leaving dusty prints on the clean floor. "Time's up, Kane. You gonna face me like a man, or are you gonna hide behind that bar all day?" Lucas continued his work, seemingly oblivious to Dax's presence. The outlaw's face darkened with rage at being ignored. "I asked you a question." Dax slammed his fist on the bar, making the glasses rattle. Still, Lucas didn't respond, didn't even look up from his task. "Boss," Clem called from the doorway. "Folks out here need some motivation to show proper respect." Dax's angry expression transformed into a cruel smile. "Well then, Let's give them a lesson they won't forget. The gang erupted into action like demons unleashed. They spread through the town, smashing windows with the butts of their rifles. The sound of breaking glass mixed with their whoops and hollers as they kicked in doors and ransacked shops. At Peterson's general store, 2 gang members helped themselves to tobacco and candy, stuffing their pockets while Martha Peterson watched helplessly from behind her counter. At the bank, another outlaw fired shots into the ceiling, laughing as the teller cowered behind his desk. "Look what I found," one of them shouted, emerging from the millinery shop with an armful of ladies' hats. He placed one jauntily on his head, prancing around in mock elegance while his companions roared with laughter. Sheriff Carver emerged from his office, his crooked hand resting on his gun. Despite his age and injury, he stood tall, his badge gleaming in the morning sun. "That's enough," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of his office. "This stops now, Roe." Dax turned slowly, a predatory smile spreading across his face. "Well, if it ain't the law." He stepped off the boardwalk into the street, his spurs ringing with each step. "Come to show us the error of our ways, Sheriff." "I'm giving you one chance to ride out," Carver said, his good hand hovering near his holster. "Just one." The street fell silent as the 2 men faced each other. Then Dax moved, faster than anyone expected. Before Carver could draw, Dax's gun slammed across his face, sending him sprawling in the dust. "You ain't giving nobody nothing," Dax snarled, standing over the fallen lawman. He reached down and ripped the badge from Carver's vest, holding it up for all to see. "This here's just a piece of tin." With deliberate cruelty, he dropped the badge and ground it under his heel until the metal bent and broke. From the saloon doorway, Lucas watched the scene unfold, his face an unreadable mask. His hands had stopped their endless cleaning, resting flat on the bar's surface as he observed the chaos spreading through his town. The gang's rampage continued, growing bolder with each passing minute. They overturned wagons, scattered feed bags, and fired shots at shop signs. The air filled with the smell of gunpowder and fear as they systematically terrorized every business on the main street. Then Ella Montgomery appeared on the boardwalk, her face flushed with anger. She'd been watching from the dry goods store, and something in her had finally snapped. "You're nothing but a coward, Dax Rowe," she called out, her voice clear and strong. "A bully who picks on people who can't fight back." The street went deadly quiet. Dax turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he focused on Ella. He crossed the distance between them in long strides, stopping just inches from where she stood. "What did you say to me, girl?" His voice was soft, dangerous. Ella lifted her chin, refusing to back down. "I said you're a coward. A real man doesn't need to terrorize innocent people to prove his worth." The crack of Dax's hand across her face echoed like a gunshot. Ella stumbled, but kept her feet, one hand pressed to her reddening cheek. A murmur of anger ran through the watching townsfolk, but fear kept them rooted in place. "Seems like this whole town needs a lesson in respect," Dax announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the street. He turned in a slow circle, making sure everyone could see him. "So here's how it's going to be. Tomorrow at noon, Silent Kane faces me in the street. If he doesn't show..." He paused, letting the tension build. "Well, what we did today will seem like a church social compared to what happens then." He strode back to the saloon, pushing through the doors to face Lucas one last time. "Noon tomorrow, Kane. Be there, or watch this whole town burn." He grinned, showing teeth like a wolf. "And wouldn't that be a shame? All these good people suffering because you're too yellow to face me?" As the gang mounted up and rode out, their laughter trailing behind them like poison, the town slowly came back to life. People emerged from hiding, helping each other clean up the mess, tend to the injured, and salvage what they could from the wreckage. Night fell over Millbrook like a funeral shroud. In his room above the saloon, Lucas sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his reflection in the cracked mirror. The weight of the town's suffering pressed down on him like a physical thing, but it wasn't their pain that finally moved him to action. It was the memory of Sarah's voice, not begging him to avoid violence, but urging him to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. It was Tommy's innocent faith in heroes and justice. It was the realization that redemption might not lie in refusing to fight, but in fighting for the right reasons. He descended to the saloon where Red Hawk waited, the tracker's dark eyes watching him with understanding. "You've made your decision," Red Hawk said. It wasn't a question. Lucas nodded once, then began moving through the saloon with purpose. Together, they worked into the night, setting more traps around the building and the town square. They stretched trip wires across likely approach routes, positioned barriers to channel movement, and prepared fallback positions. Red Hawk watched as Lucas worked, noting how his friend moved with the fluid grace of a predator despite his years of peaceful existence. "You haven't forgotten," he observed. Lucas paused in his work, shaking his head slightly. No, he hadn't forgotten. His body remembered every lesson written in blood and gunsmoke, every skill honed through years of violence. He'd buried his guns, but he hadn't buried the man who knew how to use them. As midnight approached, they finished their preparations. Red Hawk melted into the darkness to keep watch, leaving Lucas alone in the saloon. He stood behind the bar one last time, his hands resting on its familiar surface. Then, with deliberate movements, he removed his bartender's apron and vest, replacing them with a dark leather vest that had been stored away for years. The material was still supple, well-oiled despite its long rest. Next came the gun belt, its weight both foreign and familiar as he buckled it around his hips. Finally, he lifted his revolvers from their long rest in the drawer. The pearl grips seemed to glow in the lamplight as he checked each weapon with practiced care. The actions were smooth, the barrels clean. He'd maintained them even while praying he'd never use them again. Lucas Kane stood in his saloon, no longer the quiet bartender, but something else, something he'd tried to leave behind. His hands were steady as he holstered the guns, but his eyes, reflected in the back bar mirror, were filled with a complex mixture of determination and regret. Tomorrow at noon, the Blood Spurs would return, expecting to find a coward hiding behind his bar. Instead, they would face the phantom draw, and Dax Rowe would learn why some legends are better left undisturbed. The night deepened around the Last Stand Saloon, and somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called a long, lonely sound that might have been either a warning or a lament. The clock in the church tower began its slow, solemn toll, each strike echoing through the empty streets of Millbrook like a funeral bell. Noon had arrived, and with it, the moment of truth that would decide the town's fate. Main Street lay deserted, the morning breeze pushing a lone tumbleweed across the dusty ground. Shop windows that hadn't been broken in yesterday's rampage were tightly shuttered, their curtains drawn. Behind them, townsfolk peered out through tiny gaps, barely daring to breathe. "Do you think he'll come?" Martha Peterson whispered to her husband, both crouched behind their store counter, watching through a crack in the boards. "Hush now," Samuel Peterson replied, though his eyes never left the street. "Look there." The Blood Spurs rode in from the east, the sun at their backs casting long shadows before them. They spread out across the town square, their horses' hooves raising little clouds of dust in the still air. Dax Rowe dismounted with theatrical flourish, his silver spurs catching the sunlight as he stepped into the center of the street. "Come on out, Silent Kane," he called, his voice booming in the unnatural quiet. "Time to see if you're more than just a barkeep hiding behind his bottles." The gang members spread out, taking up positions along the boardwalk. Their laughter echoed off the buildings as Dax continued his taunts. "Maybe he's still sleeping," Clem shouted, drawing more laughter. "Should we wake him up with some lead?" "Nah," Dax drawled, turning in a slow circle to address his invisible audience. "Let's give him another minute. Wouldn't want anyone to say we didn't give the coward a fair chance." Behind curtains and barrels, the townspeople held their breath. Old Jed Hawkins, watching from behind a water trough, muttered under his breath, "Come on, Lucas. Show them what the phantom draw can do." As if in answer to his prayer, the doors of the Last Stand Saloon swung open. Lucas Kane stepped out onto the boardwalk, and a collective gasp ran through the hidden watchers. Gone was the quiet bartender in his clean white shirt and simple vest. In his place stood a figure straight out of legend. Lucas wore a dark leather vest over a black shirt, his gun belt riding low on his hips. The pearl-handled revolvers caught the sunlight like gems, and his normally neat hair fell loose around a face that seemed carved from stone. He moved with fluid grace as he descended the steps to the street, each step measured and deliberate. High above the scene, Red Hawk crouched on the roof of the general store, his bow ready and arrows close at hand. His keen eyes took in every detail of the situation, the positions of the gang members, the lines of fire, the potential escape routes. He caught Lucas's eye for just a moment and gave a slight nod. Whatever happened, his friend would not face this alone. Well, Dax's voice carried a note of surprise beneath its mockery. The mouse has some fight in him after all, though I gotta say, Kane, you clean up nice. Almost look like a real gunfighter in that getup. Lucas stopped about 20 paces from Dax, his hands loose at his sides, his eyes never leaving the outlaw's face. Still nothing to say? Dax's smile turned ugly. Fine. Let's see if we can make you sing another tune. His hand dropped to his gun with snake-like speed. The movement was impressive, would have been deadly against most men. But Lucas moved like lightning, his draw so fast it seemed to happen between heartbeats. There was a single sharp crack, and Dax's gun went spinning from his hand, a neat hole punched through the cylinder. The outlaw stared at his empty hand in disbelief, then at his ruined weapon lying in the dust. The street had gone deathly quiet, the only sound the soft ping of cooling metal from Dax's gun. Impossible, Dax whispered, then louder. Impossible. Boss. Clem's voice cracked with panic. He and two other gang members raised their rifles, opening fire from different angles. Lucas moved like a dancer, his gun seeming to appear in his hands by magic. 3 shots rang out in rapid succession, so close together they almost sounded like one. Clem's rifle flew from his hands. Another gang member dropped his weapon with a cry as a bullet creased his arm, and the third found his gun belt suddenly separated from his pants. Not a single shot had been lethal, but each was precisely placed to disarm and disable. The watching townsfolk began to emerge from hiding, drawn by the display of skill that seemed more magic than gunplay. Impressive, a new voice called out, followed by the sound of slow, deliberate clapping. You haven't lost your touch, old friend. A figure stepped out of the shadows between 2 buildings. A tall man with iron gray hair and a face marked by both age and cruelty. He wore a black duster despite the heat, and a silver star gleamed on his chest. Not a sheriff's badge, but a U.S. Marshal's. Lucas's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, pain, and something darker. Cole Marston. Red Hawk breathed from his perch, though too softly for anyone below to hear. What's the matter, Lucas? Cole's voice carried the weight of old wounds and bitter memories. No warm welcome for your old partner? Though I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. You always did prefer to let your guns do the talking. He walked into the street with the confidence of a man who feared nothing, stopping a few paces from where Lucas stood. 8 years, he continued, his voice hardening. 8 years I've been tracking you. Ever since you left me for dead in that burning courthouse. Did you think I'd forget? That I'd forgive? The townsfolk who had begun to emerge quickly retreated back to their hiding places, sensing that what they were witnessing now was something far more dangerous than a simple challenge between a bartender and an outlaw. You ran. Cole's voice dripped contempt. Ran and hid behind a bar while I rebuilt everything you tried to destroy. And now look at me, a U.S. Marshal, cleaning up the territory one town at a time. His smile was cold as winter. Of course, some towns need more thorough cleaning than others. He reached into his duster and withdrew a small object, a brass mechanism with wires trailing from it. Know what this is, old friend? It's the detonator for enough explosives to send this whole town straight to hell. I've had my men planting charges for days while Dax and his boys kept you distracted. A murmur of fear ran through the hidden townspeople. Cole's smile widened as he continued. So here's how this is going to work. You and me, one final dance. No tricks, no mercy, no holding back like you did with these amateurs. Just 2 old friends settling up, the way we should have 8 years ago. Lucas's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet but carried clearly in the hushed street. The town has nothing to do with this, Cole. The town has everything to do with this. Cole snapped. You think you could just hide among these people? Make a new life while I carried the scars of what you did? No, old friend. Either you face me, really face me, none of this fancy disarming trick shooting, or I send this whole place up in smoke. Lucas stood motionless, caught between his vow of peace and the lives of everyone in Millbrook. His eyes met Red Hawk's for a moment, searching for guidance, but they both knew this was a decision he had to make alone. Finally, Lucas spoke again, each word measured and deliberate, on one condition. We do this my way, outside of town, at sunset. No explosives, no innocent lives at risk. Just you and me, settling things once and for all. Cole studied him for a long moment, then laughed, a sound without any humor in it. The great Lucas Kane still trying to set the terms. But you know what? I'll play it your way one last time. Sunset it is. He backed away, keeping the detonator visible. Don't get any ideas about running, though. I've waited 8 years for this. I can wait a few more hours. As Cole disappeared back into the shadows, taking his Blood Spurs with him, the street remained silent. Lucas stood alone in the dust, the weight of his past and the fate of the town pressing down on him like a physical thing. The sun had reached its zenith, marking the beginning of the longest afternoon Millbrook would ever know. The afternoon sun hung heavy in the sky as Lucas Kane faced his old partner across the dusty street. The detonator in Cole's hand glinted menacingly, a silent reminder of the lives at stake. "Let the townspeople go, Cole," Lucas said, his voice steady. "This is between you and me. They've got nothing to do with our past." Cole tilted his head, studying Lucas with the calculated interest of a snake watching its prey. "Still playing the noble hero, aren't you? Always looking out for the innocent." His lip curled in a sneer, but something flickered in his eyes, a hint of the man he'd once been. "Fine. Let them run. It'll make our reunion more intimate. You'll remove the explosives first," Lucas pressed, knowing he had to set the terms now. "No tricks, no innocent lives at risk. Just you and me like it should have been 8 years ago." A cruel smile spread across Cole's face. "You know what? I'll agree to that. It amuses me to see you still clinging to your sense of honor." He gestured to his men. "Pull back the charges. We'll do this clean. Well, as clean as gunfire and blood can be." Red Hawk materialized silently beside Lucas as Cole and his men withdrew. "We need to move quickly," the tracker said softly. "The townsfolk must be gone before sunset." They worked efficiently, spreading the word from house to house. Sheriff Carver, despite his injured hand, organized the evacuation with quiet authority. Wagons were loaded with essential supplies, children were bundled up, and the elderly were helped onto horses and carts. "Head for Miller's Creek," Lucas instructed as families passed by. "Stay there until you get word it's safe to return." Most went without argument, understanding the gravity of the situation. But Ella Montgomery stood her ground in front of the last stand, her chin set in a familiar stubborn angle. "I'm not leaving," she declared when Lucas approached her. "This is my home too, and I won't run from it." "Ella," Lucas began, but she cut him off. "No, I've watched you carry this burden alone for too long. Whatever happens today, you won't face it by yourself." Before Lucas could respond, Cole's voice rang out from the other end of the street. "Getting sentimental in your old age, Lucas?" He sauntered closer, every step deliberate. "Remember when Sentiment got your family killed? When Sarah opened the door, thinking it was you coming home early?" The words triggered a flood of memories Lucas had fought to suppress. Suddenly he was back there, 8 years ago, riding home after a long day of tracking rustlers. He'd seen the smoke first, rising above the trees. Then he'd heard the gunfire. Sarah had been baking bread. He could still smell it burning as he'd burst through the door. She lay there, reaching for Tommy's stuffed bear. Their boy had tried to hide behind his mother, his drawings scattered across the floor, stained red. Cole had been waiting, his gang spread out around the house. "Nothing personal," he'd said, just before opening fire. But it had been personal. Revenge for Lucas exposing Cole's corruption, for trying to stop his reign of terror over the territory. The gunfight that followed had been devastating. Lucas's guns had sung their deadly song, and men had fallen like autumn leaves. But the victory had been hollow, coming too late to save what mattered most. Lucas forced himself back to the present, finding Ella's concerned face before him. "Why won't you kill him?" she asked softly. "After everything he's done?" Lucas closed his eyes for a moment. "After I buried Sarah and Tommy, I hunted down every man who was there that day. Every trigger man, every lookout, everyone who helped plan it. I killed them all, Ella. And with each death, I lost a piece of myself until there was nothing left but emptiness. He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze. I swore then that I'd never take another life, that I'd find a way to live that would honor Sarah's memory, not tarnish it with more bloodshed. Red Hawk approached quietly, his moccasins silent on the wooden floor. Then we fight smart, he said. The traps we set last night, we can use them to our advantage. Force them to fight on our terms, not theirs. Lucas nodded slowly. No more killing. But I won't let him hurt anyone else either. As if summoned by their conversation, Sheriff Carver entered the saloon. His face was bruised from yesterday's confrontation, but his eyes were clear and determined. I've got something to say, he announced, his voice stronger than it had been in years. I've been hiding behind this broken hand, using it as an excuse for my weakness. But not anymore. He drew his gun with his left hand, spinning the cylinder with practiced ease. I may not be able to shoot straight with my right anymore, but I've been practicing with my left. I'm standing with you, Lucas. This is my town, too. While they planned their defense, Cole was setting up his own strategy. He gathered his men in the abandoned livery stable, laying out his vision for the coming battle. I want men on every rooftop, he ordered. Hidden but ready. When the shooting starts, Lucas will be looking for cover. I want every possible refuge to be a death trap. He turned to Dax, who nursed his wounded pride along with his injured hand. Your boys may not be the fastest guns, but they can still shoot. Make it count. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Lucas found a letter propped against the bottle of his favorite whiskey behind the bar. The envelope bore his name in Cole's distinctive handwriting. His hands were steady as he opened it, unfolding the pages within. Lucas, by the time you read this, you'll know why I'm here. But what you don't know, what you never knew, is the full story of our shared past. Remember when I first came to town, fresh-faced and eager to serve? You were already a legend, the famous Marshal Kane, and I was just a green deputy with dreams of making a difference. You took me under your wing, taught me everything you knew. I would have died for you back then. But you never saw what was really happening in the territory. The settlers pushing out honest ranchers, the railroad barons stealing land with their paper laws. I tried to work within the system, but you were always so righteous, so sure of what was right and wrong. When I started taking payments to look the other way, it was to help the people you ignored. The small ranchers, the farmers who couldn't compete with the big operations. Yes, I got rich doing it, but I was trying to balance the scales. Then you found out, and instead of talking to me, instead of trying to understand, you threatened to expose everything. You betrayed me, Lucas. You, who I thought of as a brother. So yes, I came for your family. Because I wanted you to feel the same pain of betrayal that I felt. I wanted you to know what it was like to lose everything you loved. And now here we are, 8 years later. Time for one last lesson between teacher and student. Cole. Lucas folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his vest pocket. Outside, the sun was touching the western hills, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. He walked to the saloon's entrance, taking in the sight of his home, perhaps for the last time. The street was empty now, the townspeople safely away. Only a few remained. Red Hawk checking his bow one final time, Sheriff Carver positioning himself at a window, Ella watching him with worried eyes. The traps they'd set were ready, the strategy in place. In the distance, he could hear Cole's men taking up their positions. The time for memories and regrets was over. As the sun set on Millbrook, Lucas Kane stood in the doorway of the Last Stand Saloon, ready to face both the ghosts of his past and the very real demons of his present. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and dust, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, a church bell tolled, marking not the hour, but perhaps the beginning of the end. The last rays of sunlight painted Millbrook's main street in shades of amber and blood as Lucas Kane walked out of the Last Stand Saloon. His boots struck the wooden boards of the boardwalk with measured steps, each one echoing in the unnatural silence that had fallen over the town. From the opposite end of the street emerged Cole Marston, his black duster billowing slightly in the evening breeze. The two men approached the town square like opposing forces of nature, their shadows stretching long behind them in the fading light. They met in the center of the street, 20 paces apart, close enough to speak, far enough to draw. The tension in the air was almost visible, like heat waves rising from sun-baked earth. Brings back memories, doesn't it? Cole's voice carried clearly in the still air. You and me, facing each other. Though last time, we had an audience. His lips curved in a cruel smile. Sarah always did love watching you practice your quick draw. Remember how she'd clap when you'd show off for her? And little Tommy, he shook his head in mock sadness. That boy worshipped the ground you walked on. Lucas remained motionless, his face an impassive mask, but his right hand had drifted closer to his gun. Nothing to say? Cole continued, his voice hardening. You had plenty to say 8 years ago, when you were passing judgment on me. When you decided your precious law was more important than loyalty, than brotherhood. Above them, hidden in the lengthening shadows of the buildings, Red Hawk watched with arrow nocked and ready. Sheriff Carver had positioned himself at a second-story window, his left hand steady on his gun. They could see Cole's men, too, poorly concealed on various rooftops and behind water barrels. Your family died because of your righteousness, Lucas, Cole spat. Their blood is on your hands, not mine. I just delivered the message. Lucas's voice, when it finally came, was quiet but carried clearly. No, Cole. They died because you were a coward who couldn't face me alone. The words hung in the air for a heartbeat. Then both men moved. Their draws were so fast they seemed simultaneous, twin thunderclaps in the gathering dusk. Lucas's bullet traced a line across Cole's shoulder, drawing first blood. Cole's shot whispered past Lucas's ear, close enough that he felt the wind of its passing. Before either man could fire again, the evening exploded into chaos. Cole's men opened fire from their hiding places, sending bullets whining through the air like angry hornets. But Red Hawk and Sheriff Carver were ready. The tracker's bow sang out, his arrows finding marks with surgical precision, a gun hand here, a rifle barrel there. Each shot was carefully placed to disarm rather than kill, following Lucas's example. From his position, Carver's left-handed shots might not have been as accurate as in his prime, but they were enough to keep the gang members pinned down. Lucas and Cole closed the distance between them, their guns forgotten, as they crashed together in a brutal contest of strength. Cole fought with the fury of 8 years of hatred, his attacks wild and powerful. Lucas met him with the calm precision that had marked his gunplay, deflecting rather than blocking, turning Cole's rage against him. I trusted you, Cole roared, landing a heavy blow to Lucas's ribs. You were like a brother to me, and you betrayed everything we stood for, Lucas replied, his voice steady despite the pain. He slipped under Cole's next punch, using the bigger man's momentum to throw him off balance. They grappled in the dusty street, trading blows that echoed off the abandoned buildings. Cole managed to get the upper hand, pinning Lucas against a hitching post. His hands closed around Lucas's throat, eyes wild with vengeful triumph. Suddenly, a glass lantern shattered between them, spraying burning oil across the ground. Cole leaped back with a curse as flames erupted, creating a barrier between him and his prey. Ella stood on the boardwalk, another lantern ready in her hands. Get away from him, she shouted, her voice fierce with protection. The momentary distraction was all Lucas needed. He rolled clear of the flames, coming up in a fighting stance. But before either man could re-engage, a massive explosion rocked the town square. One of Cole's men, caught in the crossfire between Red Hawk's arrows and Carver's bullets, had fallen onto his own detonator. The charges that hadn't been fully removed exploded in a chain reaction, setting the livery stable ablaze and sending burning debris raining down on the street. Through the smoke and chaos, Lucas saw Ella stumble as a burning beam crashed down near her. Without hesitation, he sprinted through the flames, tackling her clear of the falling debris. They rolled together, coming to rest behind an overturned wagon as more explosions lit up the evening sky. Are you hurt? He asked, quickly checking her for injuries. I'm fine, she assured him, then her eyes widened. Lucas, look out. He spun to find Cole advancing through the smoke, his face lit by the surrounding fires. The marshal star on his chest gleamed orange in the firelight as he raised his gun. It ends now, Lucas, he growled. No more running. No more hiding behind others. Time seemed to slow as the two men faced each other one final time. The crackling of flames, the shouts of men, the distant crash of falling timber, all faded away. There was only the space between them, heavy with 8 years of pain and betrayal. Cole fired first, his shot wild with rage and desperation. Lucas's draw was smooth as silk, precise as surgery. 2 shots rang out in perfect synchronization. Cole's gun went spinning from his hand, along with his marshal's star, both knocked away by Lucas's perfectly placed bullets. Cole stared at his empty hand, then at Lucas, disbelief warring with anger on his face. "What are you waiting for?" he demanded. "Finish it." Lucas lowered his gun. "No," he said simply. "It ends here, Cole, but not with more death. You can't just walk away from this." Cole made a move toward his fallen gun, but froze as Sheriff Carver's voice rang out. "Don't move, Marston." The sheriff emerged from the smoke, his left-handed draw rock steady. "You're under arrest." Cole looked around wildly, seeing his men either disarmed or fled, the fires being contained by a bucket brigade of returning townspeople, and Lucas standing straight and tall despite his injuries. Something seemed to break in him then, as if the weight of 8 years of hatred had suddenly become too heavy to bear. "It should have been different," he whispered, dropping to his knees in the dusty street. "We could have owned this territory, you and me, could have had everything." "I had everything," Lucas replied quietly. "A family, a home, a partner I trusted like a brother. You're the one who threw it all away." Sheriff Carver moved forward with a pair of handcuffs, his injuries forgotten in the rush of restored authority. As he secured Cole's wrists, he spoke with quiet dignity. "Cole Marston, you're under arrest for murder, conspiracy, corruption under the color of law, and about a dozen other charges I'll think of on the way to the territorial prison." Red Hawk appeared silently beside Lucas, watching as Cole was led away. "You could have killed him," the tracker observed. "Perhaps some would say you should have." Lucas holstered his guns with slow, deliberate movements. "There's been enough killing," he said. "Sarah always believed there was a better way. Maybe it's time I started believing that too." Ella approached, carrying a bucket of water to help with the fires. She paused beside Lucas, looking up at him with a mixture of pride and understanding. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Lucas looked around at the town, at the fires being extinguished, at neighbors helping neighbors, at Sheriff Carver standing tall despite his injuries as he secured his prisoner. Most importantly, he looked at the Last Stand Saloon, still standing despite everything. "Now," he said, the ghost of a smile touching his lips, "now I think I need a drink, and maybe it's time I started talking a bit more." The sun had fully set, but the streets were lit by lanterns and the last of the dying fires as the townspeople began to return. They moved through the town square, assessing damage and helping where needed, but many paused to nod respectfully to the quiet bartender, who had proved to be so much more. In the distance, a coyote called, not a lonely sound this time, but almost like a celebration. The night wind carried away the last traces of gin smoke, and with it, the ghost that had haunted Lucas Kane for 8 long years. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, there was peace in the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from taking a life, but from choosing to spare one. Dawn broke over Millbrook, painting the sky in gentle pinks and golds that seemed at odds with the destruction below. As the morning light crept through the streets, it illuminated the price of the previous night's battle: scorched buildings, broken windows, and debris scattered across the dusty ground. The townsfolk returned slowly at first, then in growing numbers as word spread that the danger had passed. They gathered in small groups, surveying the damage with mixed expressions of dismay and relief. The livery stable was a blackened shell, and several other buildings bore the scars of fire and gunfire. Yet somehow, the heart of their town had survived. Martha Peterson stood in front of her general store, brushing ash from the porch. "Could have been worse," she said to no one in particular. "Could have lost everything. But we didn't," Samuel Peterson replied, already working to repair a broken window. "Thanks to Lucas Kane." The name rippled through the gathering crowd like a warm breeze. Many glanced toward the Last Stand Saloon, where Lucas was already at work, clearing debris from around the building. His movements were slower than usual, evidence of the previous night's brutal fight, but he worked with the same quiet determination he brought to everything. Ella Montgomery watched him from the boardwalk, her heart full of emotions she couldn't quite name. Finally, she approached him, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the makeshift kitchen some of the women had set up in the church basement. "You saved my life last night," she said softly, offering him one of the cups. "That burning beam would have." Lucas accepted the coffee with a slight nod, but Ella wasn't finished. "You saved all of us, really. Not just from the Blood Spurs, but from Marston too. I want to help rebuild the saloon. We all do." He started to shake his head, but Ella pressed on. "This isn't just charity or gratitude, Lucas. The Last Stand is as much my home as it is yours. Let me help make it whole again." Something shifted in Lucas's expression, a softening around the eyes, a slight easing of the tension he always carried. He didn't speak, but he nodded, and Ella's smile could have lit up the darkest night. Down the street, Sheriff Carver was organizing cleanup efforts with newfound authority. His left-handed draw during the fight had restored more than just his confidence. It had given him back his sense of purpose. People listened now when he spoke, respect replacing the pity they'd shown before. "Anderson, get your boys working on that roof before we get rain," he called out. "Williams, I need those water barrels refilled. Mrs. Cooper, if you could organize a crew to clear the debris from the street." Each command was met with immediate action, the town working together like a well-oiled machine. At the jail, Marston sat in a cell, waiting for the prison wagon that would take him to the territorial prison. His marshal star lay on Carver's desk, its silver surface scarred by Lucas's bullet. When Carver brought him breakfast, Cole finally spoke. "He should have killed me," he said, his voice rough. "Would have been simpler." "Maybe," Carver replied, sliding the plate through the bars. "But then he wouldn't be Lucas Kane." Cole's laugh was bitter. "No, I suppose not. Always had to do things his own way." He turned to stare out the small window. "Won't change anything, though. Prison walls can't hold hate." "Maybe not," Carver agreed. "But they can give a man time to think about whether the hate is worth holding on to." Throughout the morning, townspeople approached Lucas with offers of help, thanks, and congratulations. To each, he gave the same quiet response: "I just did what had to be done." Then he would return to his work, rebuilding what had been broken, restoring what had been damaged. As the sun climbed higher, Red Hawk appeared beside Lucas, silent as a shadow. The tracker watched his friend work for a moment before speaking. "The path of peace is harder than the path of violence," he said thoughtfully. "It takes more courage to spare a life than to take one." He placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "You honored your wife's memory last night, my friend. Not by refusing to fight, but by choosing how to end the fight." Lucas paused in his work, looking at his old friend. "Will you stay?" he asked. Red Hawk shook his head, a small smile playing at his lips. "My path leads elsewhere. But I leave knowing you have found your way back to yourself." He gestured to the town around them, where people work together, helping neighbors, rebuilding their community. Sometimes it takes a storm to show people their own strength. The tracker's departure was as quiet as his arrival had been, but his words lingered like morning mist in a valley. The day wore on, and Millbrook began to show signs of recovery. Windows were repaired, debris was cleared, and the sound of hammers and saws filled the air. The town had been wounded but not broken, and in many ways, the shared work of rebuilding was bringing people closer together. As evening approached, Ella found Lucas taking a rare break on the saloon's porch. She sat beside him, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that reminded her of healing bruises. "I've been thinking," she said after a comfortable silence, "about the saloon's name." Lucas turned to look at her, one eyebrow raised slightly. "The Last Stand is a good name," she continued, "but maybe it's time for something new. Something that honors the past while looking to the future." She took a deep breath. "What about Sarah and Tommy's?" Lucas went very still, and for a moment Ella feared she had overstepped. But then she saw the moisture in his eyes, quickly blinked away, and knew she had said exactly the right thing. The next morning, Lucas rose before dawn and walked the familiar path to the cemetery. The 3 crosses stood as they always had, but something felt different. He knelt between Sarah and Tommy's graves, placing fresh wildflowers as he had so many times before. "I think I finally understand," he said softly. "What you were trying to tell me, Sarah, about there being different kinds of strength." He touched Tommy's cross gently. "Your ma was right, son. As usual, The morning breeze carried the scent of sage and new-mown hay, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark began to sing. Lucas stood, looking down at the graves one last time. The weight of grief was still there, but it had changed somehow, become more like a cherished memory than an open wound. That evening, as the sun set on a partially rebuilt Millbrook, the newly christened Sarah and Tommy's opened its doors. The bar had been repaired, the windows replaced, and though some scars of the recent battle remained, they seemed more like badges of honor than wounds. Lucas stood behind the bar, watching as people filtered in. Sheriff Carver sat in his usual spot, his left hand resting comfortably near his gun. Martha Peterson and Samuel shared a quiet table in the corner. Dick Williams and Marcus Thompson were already arguing good-naturedly about the best way to rebuild the livery stable. Ella moved through the crowd with practiced ease, serving drinks and sharing smiles. When she passed behind the bar, her hand brushed Lucas's arm, a gesture so natural it felt like it had been happening for years. "Mr. Kane," Billy Preston called out, his young face earnest. Would you tell us about Sarah and Tommy?" The saloon grew quiet, everyone turning to look at the usually silent bartender. Lucas picked up a glass and began to polish it. Some habits die hard. But then, to everyone's surprise and delight, he began to speak. "Sarah loved wildflowers," he said, his voice soft but carrying clearly in the hushed room. "She'd fill the house with them every spring." And Tommy, a small smile touched his lips. "Tommy could draw horses better than any artist I ever saw." As Lucas's quiet words filled the saloon, painting pictures of love and family and precious memories, the last rays of sunlight slipped through the new windows, turning the bottles behind the bar into gems of amber and ruby. The warm light caught the small sign above the door, Sarah and Tommy's, painted in fresh gold leaf, making it glow like a beacon. In that moment, the saloon felt less like a business and more like a home. And Lucas Kane, the quiet bartender who had become so much more, finally felt at peace with both his past and his future. He had found his voice again, and with it, a new kind of strength, one that Sarah would have understood completely. 3 months after Cole Marston's defeat, Millbrook had settled into a peaceful rhythm. The scars of the battle were healing, buildings repaired, businesses thriving, and Sarah and Tommy's saloon had become the heart of the community. But peace, as Lucas Kane knew too well, was often just the quiet before another storm. The stranger rode in on a cool autumn morning, his duster gray with trail dust, his horse showing signs of a long journey. He didn't announce his arrival with gunfire like the Blood Spurs had. Instead, he moved through town like a shadow, asking quiet questions in quiet corners. "Kane," he would say, his voice soft but carrying an edge like a well-honed knife. "Lucas Kane? Used to be a marshal, I hear. Ten's bar now, that right?" Word of the stranger's inquiries reached Lucas through Billy Preston, who burst into the saloon just before noon. "Mr. Kane, there's a man asking about you. Tall fellow, got a scar running down his neck into his collar." Lucas continued wiping glasses, his movements unhurried, but Ella saw the slight tension in his shoulders. She'd learned to read his silences over the past months, to understand the different qualities of his quiet. This wasn't his peaceful quiet. This was the stillness of a mountain lion sensing danger. That evening, as Lucas checked the saloon's doors and windows, a habit he'd never abandoned, he noticed small signs that raised his guard. Boot prints in the alley that shouldn't be there. A curtain moving in an empty building across the street. Someone was watching the saloon, studying its routines. The next morning brought a message from Red Hawk, carried by a young brave who had ridden through the night to deliver it. The note was brief, written in the tracker's precise hand. "Brother, Cole's allies stir like wasps in a fallen nest. His brother James rides with dark purpose. Watch the shadows. Red Hawk." Lucas folded the message carefully, tucking it into his vest pocket. He'd known this peace couldn't last forever, had felt it in his bones even as he'd rebuilt his life here. Word of the stranger's questions spread through town like wildfire, but the response wasn't what an outsider might have expected. Instead of fear, there was determination. Instead of hiding, the townspeople drew together. "We remember what you did for us," Sheriff Carver said during his daily visit to the saloon. His left-handed draw had become legendary in its own right. "Any trouble comes calling, it'll find more than one gun waiting. Dick Williams and Marcus Thompson made a point of moving their evening card games to Sarah and Tommy's, their presence a quiet statement of support. Martha Peterson began keeping her shotgun within easy reach under the store counter, and Samuel practiced his shooting behind their shop. Ella watched these preparations with growing concern. One evening, as they closed up the saloon together, something that had become their nightly ritual, she finally spoke her fears. "You could leave," she said softly, her hand resting on his arm. "No one would blame you. You've given this town more than enough already." Lucas looked down at her hand, then met her eyes. "This is my home now," he said simply. His voice was quiet but firm, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Before Ella could respond, young Billy Preston rushed in, waving an envelope. "Mr. Kane, this just came on the evening stage. It's from the territorial prison." The letter bore the prison's official stamp, but the handwriting inside was unmistakably Cole's. "Lucas, remember when we were deputies together, how you taught me that every man casts two shadows, the one behind him and the one in his soul? You cast a long shadow, old friend, long enough to reach through these prison walls, long enough to touch those you care about. Some debts can't be settled with prison bars between us. Some stories don't end just because you want them to. Watch your shadow, Lucas. See who's standing in it. Cole." Lucas read the letter twice, then set it aflame with a match, watching it curl and blacken in the ashtray. Ella's face had gone pale as she watched him, understanding dawning in her eyes. "The stranger," she whispered. "He's not just asking questions, is he?" Before Lucas could answer, the saloon's doors swung open. The stranger stood framed in the doorway, sunset at his back painting him in shades of blood and gold. Now they could all see the scar clearly, a pale line that ran from his jaw down into his collar like a badly healed wound. "Evening," he said softly. "Name's James Marston. Reckon you knew my brother Cole." The resemblance was there in the set of his jaw, the cold calculation in his eyes. But where Cole's rage had burned hot, James Marston carried ice in his veins. "Your brother made his choice," Lucas said, his voice level. "It's over." James's laugh was soft and entirely without humor. "Over? No, Mr. Kane. My brother may be in prison, but the story he started? That's far from over." He moved into the saloon with measured steps. "You see, Cole told me everything. About how you two were like brothers once. About how you betrayed him. About what he did to your family." Lucas remained still behind the bar, but his hands had dropped below the counter where his guns waited. "Thing is," James continued, "family's important to me too. So I've spent 3 months studying this town, learning its rhythms, finding its weak points." His smile was colder than a mountain stream. "Did you know the new livery stable support beams aren't properly braced yet? One well-placed charge." He shrugged. "And that's just the start. If you're looking for revenge," Lucas said quietly, "deal with me directly." "Oh, I intend to. But first, I want you to understand what's coming. Want you to feel that shadow growing longer and darker with each passing day." James backed toward the door. "We're not done, Kane. Not by a long shot." He disappeared into the gathering darkness, his words hanging in the air like smoke after a gunfight. The next few days saw Lucas preparing the saloon once more for trouble. But this time was different. This time he wasn't alone. Sheriff Carver organized patrols, keeping watch for any sign of James or his allies. The townspeople took turns standing guard at strategic points, determined not to be caught unaware again. Dick Williams and his sons reinforced the livery stable supports, working through the night to remove that vulnerability. Martha Peterson organized the women into teams, stockpiling medical supplies and ammunition. Even old Jed Hawkins found purpose, his keen eyes watching the horizon from his favorite perch on the church roof. Lucas observed all this with a mixture of gratitude and concern. Each person who stood with him was another potential target, another life he was responsible for. But he also understood that this was their choice, their way of claiming their town, their home. One evening, as the sun set behind the distant mountains, Lucas stood on the saloon's porch with Ella. The autumn wind carried the scent of sage and wood smoke, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, a sound that seemed to echo the wildness and uncertainty of their situation. "When I came to Millbrook," Lucas said softly. I thought I was just looking for a quiet place to hide from my past. Somewhere I could disappear into silence and never have to face what I'd lost. He turned to look at her. Instead, I found something worth fighting for. Ella's hand found his, their fingers intertwining naturally. Whatever comes, she said, we face it together. Lucas nodded, his eyes scanning the darkening street. James Marston was out there somewhere, plotting his revenge, spinning his web of threats and fear. But this time was different. This time, Lucas Kane wasn't a lone gunslinger carrying the weight of loss and vengeance. He was part of something larger, a community that had chosen to stand together against the darkness. The wind picked up, making the saloon's new sign creak slightly. Sarah and Tommy's glowed in the last light of day, a reminder of what had been lost and what had been found. Lucas's hand tightened slightly on Ella's as he made his decision. Whatever James Marston was planning, whatever shadow lay across their future, they would face it head-on, together. The night deepened around them, but the lights of Sarah and Tommy's burned bright and warm, a beacon in the gathering darkness. Inside, the sounds of town life continued. Laughter, conversation, the clink of glasses, the shuffle of cards. Life going on, despite the threats and shadows, because that's what life does. That's what people do when they have something worth protecting. Lucas Kane stood watch, ready for whatever might come. He was no longer the silent bartender, no longer the legendary phantom draw, but something new, a man who had found his voice, his home, and his purpose. A man who understood that some fights were worth the cost, especially when you didn't have to face them alone. Seasons turned like pages in a book, and Millbrook flourished under the quiet protection of Lucas Kane. Spring brought new grass and fresh paint to the buildings. Summer filled the streets with the laughter of children playing without fear. And autumn painted the surrounding hills in gold and crimson. The shadow of James Marston's threat had faded like morning mist, though Lucas never fully dropped his guard. Sarah and Tommy's saloon had become more than just a business. It was the heart of the community, a place where stories were shared, deals were made, and friendships were forged. Lucas still tended bar with his characteristic quiet efficiency, but now his silence was punctuated by occasional words, even rare smiles. The change in Lucas was most noticeable when Ella was near. Their dance of growing affection had become the town's favorite unopened love story. It was in the way his eyes followed her movement through the saloon, in how she could make him smile with just a word, in the comfortable silence they shared during quiet evening hours. You know, Martha Peterson said one evening to her husband, I haven't seen two people more meant for each other since we were young. Samuel Peterson chuckled, watching Lucas and Ella close up the saloon together. Reckon you're right, though they're taking their sweet time about it. The town council, led by Dick Williams, decided it was time to show their appreciation for everything Lucas had done for Millbrook. Despite his protests, they organized a frontier festival in his honor, complete with competitions, music, and enough food to feed 3 towns. It's not just about you, Ella told him when he tried to object. It's about what you represent, how one person standing up for what's right can change everything. The festival drew people from all over the territory. The main street was decorated with bunting and flags, and the sound of fiddle music filled the air. Children ran races, men competed in shooting contests, though notably, no one asked Lucas to participate, and women displayed their best pies and preserves. During the celebrations, Sheriff Carver made an announcement that brought a round of applause from the gathered crowd. He introduced young Tom Wilson as Millbrook's new deputy, the former rancher's son, having proved himself during the town's recent troubles. A town needs more than one lawman, Carver declared, pinning the badge on Tom's chest. Especially a growing town like ours. And growing it was. Word of Lucas Kane's stand against the Blood Spurs and Marston had spread throughout the territory. Travelers went out of their way to stop in Millbrook, hoping to catch a glimpse of the legendary phantom draw who had become a peaceful bartender. Many ended up staying, drawn by the town's prosperity and sense of security. The railroad had increased its stops, bringing new businesses and opportunities. The general store expanded, a proper hotel was built, and even a small newspaper office opened its doors. Through it all, Lucas watched with quiet satisfaction, knowing that peace had brought more prosperity than violence ever could. One crisp morning, as Lucas was receiving a delivery of supplies, a young boy no more than 12 years old walked into the saloon. He had dark hair and eyes that seemed somehow familiar, carrying a worn carpet bag and a letter. "Are you Lucas Kane?" the boy asked, his voice carrying a slight tremor of nervousness. Lucas nodded, studying the boy's face. "My name's James, Jamie Kane. I'm Sarah's sister's boy." He held out the letter with a slightly shaking hand. "Ma passed last month. She told me to find you." Lucas took the letter, his hands steady despite the shock. The handwriting was indeed his sister-in-law's, explaining how she'd followed his story from afar, how she'd wanted to reach out for years but hadn't known how. Now, with her final illness upon her, she asked Lucas to take in her son, the nephew he'd never known he had. Looking at Jamie, Lucas could see Sarah in the shape of his eyes, Tommy in the set of his jaw. It was like seeing ghosts made flesh, but instead of bringing pain, it brought an unexpected sense of hope. The boy quickly became a fixture at the saloon, helping with chores and soaking up stories about his aunt and cousin. His presence seemed to complete something in Lucas's life, filling a void he hadn't fully acknowledged. One evening, as Lucas watched Jamie helping Ella clean up after closing, a thought began to take root. Perhaps it was time for a change. The saloon was thriving, the town was safe, and there was a whole world out there that Jamie should see. "You're thinking of leaving," Ella said later, reading his silence as she always could. "Thinking about it," Lucas admitted. "The boy needs more than a saloon for a home. And you." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You've more than earned the right to make this place truly yours." Before Ella could respond, the saloon's doors swung open. James Marston stood there, months of planning written in the hard lines of his face. But something was different. The cold rage had been replaced by a weariness that spoke of long nights and longer thoughts. The town responded instantly to the threat. Within minutes, armed townspeople surrounded the saloon, led by Sheriff Carver and Deputy Wilson. But Lucas raised his hand, signaling them to wait. "Let him speak," Lucas said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute calm. James looked around at the unified front the town presented, then back at Lucas. "Cole died last week," he said finally. "Prison fever. He wrote me a letter before he went." He pulled a crumpled paper from his coat. "Told me to read it, then bring it to you." Lucas accepted the letter, unfolding it carefully. "Brother, death has a way of clearing a man's vision. I've had time to think in here, time to remember who we were before hatred twisted everything. The truth is, Lucas was right all those years ago. We were supposed to protect people, not profit from their fear. Let in, James. The hate's killed enough of us already." "Cole." James watched as Lucas read, then spoke again, his voice rough with emotion. "I spent months planning how to hurt you, how to destroy everything you built here. But looking at all this," he gestured at the town, at the people standing ready to defend it, "I finally understand what Cole lost sight of, what real strength looks like." Lucas studied the man before him, seeing not an enemy now, but someone else who had been wounded by the past. "There's always another choice," he said quietly. "Yeah," James agreed. "I'm making it now." He unbuckled his gun belt, letting it fall to the floor. "I'm done. The feud dies here." The tension in the room broke like a fever. People began to lower their weapons, and Ella stepped forward with an offer of coffee. The gathered townspeople dispersed, returning to their homes and businesses, though many cast backward glances to assure themselves that peace had really won the day. As spring turned to summer again, Lucas made his decision. He signed the saloon over to Ella, though everyone knew it was just a formality. They'd been married in the spring, in a ceremony that brought the whole town together in celebration. Jamie took to his new aunt immediately, and the three of them began planning a journey, not running away this time, but moving forward together. They would travel, showing Jamie the wider world, but always knowing they had a home to return to. On their last night in Millbrook, the saloon was packed with well-wishers. Sheriff Carver raised a toast to the man who had taught them all that true strength often comes in the quietest packages. Martha Peterson cried unashamedly, while Samuel pretended he had dust in his eyes. Deputy Wilson stood proud in his badge, promising to keep the peace they had all worked so hard to build. Lucas stood behind his bar one final time, looking out over the crowd. He saw not customers but family, a family forged in adversity and strengthened by choice. The name Sarah and Tommy's would remain, but now it would stand for something more, a legacy of redemption, of choosing peace over violence, of finding strength in community rather than solitude. As the evening wore on, Lucas stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The street looked different now from that first day when a silent bartender had faced down the Blood Spurs. The town had grown, prospered, found its own strength, and he had grown with it, learning that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in facing down evil with a gun, but in offering redemption to those who might choose a better path. The setting sun painted the sky in familiar colors of gold and purple, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, not a lonely sound anymore, but a reminder that even in the wild places, no one truly walks alone. Lucas Kane, no longer the silent bartender, no longer the legendary phantom draw, but something better, a man who had found his voice, his family, and his peace, smiled as Ella and Jamie joined him on the porch. Tomorrow they would ride out together, leaving behind a legacy of courage and redemption that would be told and retold in Millbrook for generations to come. But that was tomorrow. For now, there was the warm evening air, the sound of laughter from the saloon, and the knowledge that sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of another. What would you do if you had to choose between the peace you've built and the justice that calls your name? Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with guns, but with the choices we make when violence and peace stand at a crossroads. If you enjoyed this tale of redemption, courage, and quiet strength, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that explore the complex hearts of complex heroes. Until our next story, remember, sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that know when to stay silent.